and answers, and there's only one rule for the questions. Please make all questions in the form of a question. Okay? Sam.
You guys are going to get tired of hearing me talk by the end of all this. But this is an important topic. What I want to spend a little time talking with you about today is gender identity or transgenderism, the modern movement that suggests people can change their gender. It's kind of swept Western culture. I gave a talk on this on Capitol Hill in December, and at the end, met a person who actually had transitioned genders fully, who was there. So maybe that's you. Maybe you're here and you've changed genders, and I just want to say you're welcome here. I'm going to teach on this from a biblical worldview, and I'm happy to talk to people from all different perspectives afterwards, but thanks for being here. Let me pray, and we'll turn to this topic. Lord, be with us now. You are the creator God, and you're the redeemer God, and our bodies, how you made them, coheres with how you will raise them from the dead. And we pray that you would glorify your name, Lord, in how we understand and think about the fact that in the beginning you made them male and female. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. So a couple years ago, National Geographic put out an issue, it might have been, 2017 or something like that, called The Gender Revolution. And on the cover were young individuals who all identified as very different genders: fluid, androgynous, trans man, trans woman, and so forth. And really, to land on National Geographic as a special issue really let you know that this has become a big topic. They put out a documentary that year with Katie Couric, the newscaster, on it. And since then, it's really just kind of washed through our culture, and it's almost normative now to think about transgenderism. And it's a challenging topic. I just want to put that on the table to begin. And it's challenging for several reasons. It's challenging because it's controversial. I mean, there's legal ramifications for some of you, depending on where you work, on whether or not you're going to adhere to certain views about gender. So it's controversial. It's also very personal. In my work as a pastor, I talk to people who either are confused about their gender, or more often than not, parents who have teenagers or young 20-somethings who are transitioning. And it's a hard topic to talk about because it's so personal. It may affect you or someone you know. It's also a challenging topic, though, because it's really complex. You almost could picture yourself standing at the middle of a really busy intersection when you talk about gender identity, right? And there's all these roads converging. And one road is kind of ideological issues. People from different ideologies think about it differently. One road are legal issues. Another road is maybe psychology, how psychologists are thinking about it. Then you have another road coming, and it has to do with people's personal faith commitments. And so there's actually a lot going on. School curriculums. There's a lot going on when you talk about this topic, which all makes it challenging. So right out of the gate, let me just suggest a Christian approach to a challenging topic. What's a Christian approach look like? And you can apply this to any tough topic if you're a Christian, but 3 C's: clarity, compassion, and civility. Because Christians believe in truth, in absolute truth. Like at the end of the day, it's not all going to be a conversation about what's right and wrong in heaven. It's like, that was right, that was wrong. Because of that, we pursue clarity. We do so humbly and prayerfully, but we pursue clarity. And friends, clarity is actually really hard work. So if you want to understand gender identity, how it relates to embodiment and psychology, it's actually hard work. But I think if you're a Christian, it's like trying to understand immigration. It's just hard. It's not simple. And people just want to reach for slogans. So if you're a Christian, be ready to work for clarity. Listen before you speak. Do some reading. So first is clarity. The second is compassion. I think along with the courage to seek the truth, Christians also follow a Lord who wept when he was around hurting people. And he came to heal. And because we ourselves are sinful and broken, I'm certainly not speaking from the moral high ground, and no Christian is. We ought to be able to show compassion to people who are confused about anything, but especially their gender. So clarity, compassion, and third, civility. Civility is kind of an old word, not used a ton, and it just means being civil in how you interact with other people. And what I mean by that is, imagine you're in a situation and you're a parent, and your child is deciding that they're going to change their gender. And maybe you have a different worldview than they do. I'll argue here that that's not possible. But you will say, honey, we can't embrace this. And they say something like, how can you deny me my gender identity? Civility looks like this, and it looks at them and says, okay, you have your gender identity, meaning identity is very important to you. Identity is kind of like the sacred cow in our culture. Once your identity is on the table, people can't mess with it. So as a Christian, you can say, I would like to put my faith identity next to your gender identity. This is my faith identity is actually more important than my gender. It's at the deepest part of me. And honey, my faith identity, are you going to reject me for that? And my faith identity, it has certain implications for how I think about the body and creation and gender. So for civility's sake, if we're going to create space for your gender identity, we need to create space for my faith identity. So that's just an idea of what I mean by civility. Trying to create space with people we're talking about to say, well, my faith identity has implications for how I think about gender. Can I please have a chance to share my opinion as well? And would you be tolerant of my identity as I do so, my faith identity? So those are just a few things, 3 C's: clarity, compassion, and civility to keep in mind. Let me also, this is all by way of introduction, define some terms and some limits in terms of what I'm going to talk about with our time. We're going to be addressing the T in the popular acronym LGBT. Sometimes it has a few more letters on it, but we're going to be looking at the T. The T stands for transgender or transgenderism. And so I'm not going to be talking about the L as lesbian, the G is gay, the B is bisexual. I'm not talking about sexual orientation right now. There's not necessarily any correlation between sexual orientation and gender identity or gender confusion. There may be some, but I'm not talking about those. So this is not a conversation about homosexuality or lesbianism or gayness. This is a conversation about transgenderism or gender identity. I'm also not going to be talking about an actual physical phenomenon called intersex, or maybe it's better known as disorders of sexual development. And this is a rare instance where a child is actually born with some ambiguity. Chromosomally, things have happened where their genitalia haven't developed correctly. And according to the pediatric endocrinologist Quentin Van Meter, he says the following: the exceedingly rare disorders of sexual development, this is intersex, are all medically identifiable deviations from the sexual binary norm, male and female. The 2006 Consensus Statement of the Intersex Society of North America and the 2015 revision of the statement does not endorse DSD as a third sex. So this is what in the ancient world they might call a hermaphrodite. I say that, and this is super important for the rest of this talk, because intersex, these phenomena, which are extremely rare, they are a physical reality. I am not talking about that in this conversation. What I'm talking about is a psychological reality. And so the more important term in today's gender movement is not intersex, it's gender dysphoria. Has anybody heard that term before? Gender dysphoria, it's the clinical term. If you look at the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which a psychologist would use, that's the term you would find. It's a clinical term for individuals experiencing severe and persistent discomfort between their biological sex and their psychological sense of gender. So biologically, there's no ambiguity. Their chromosomes are clear, their genitalia are clear, there's nothing wrong with them physically. But inwardly, in their feelings, and these can be very real feelings of confusion, inwardly, there's dysphoria. dysphoria just means the opposite of euphoria. It's confusion between how they feel about their sex, being male or female or otherwise, inwardly, and the reality of their body on the outside. A few years ago, a family asked me to meet with their high school daughter who was expressing a desire to transition to be a boy. And it was a Christian family, and I would go over to the house about once a month for a year, and I would just do a Bible study right in the house, the parents right around the corner, and kind of talk to this young woman. And she said she had gender dysphoria. So she had a perfectly normal female body, but she felt she was a boy. And so she was binding her chest, and she had cropped her hair short and was wearing some masculine dress to experiment with a masculine identity. And she told me, this was interesting, she was a Christian. She said to me, she said that while she was biologically female, and she didn't deny that, she said that somehow she had kind of gotten the wrong body, and she actually, in her true essence, was male. That's the question that we have to wrestle with. Is that possible? Could your gender be reduced to a feeling that you have that has nothing to do with the body that you were created with? And that's really the question Christians have to wrestle with. And my friend's question really introduced what has happened really since the 1960s with this whole notion of sex and gender identity. Up until the 1960s, biological sex and gender identity were basically the same thing. Like when a doctor announced if you had a boy or a girl, he wasn't asking the baby to describe their inner sense of being. He was looking at the body. It's a boy. It's a girl. The gender is the sex, the biological sex. But after the 1960s, these two things were separated. So today, biological sex, it still refers to chromosomes, anatomical features, reproductive organs, and even the most progressive people will admit that people come in one of two sexes chromosomally. I mean, it's just obvious, and you can see it. But now, gender identity has been unmoored from this physical anchor. And when something's unmoored like this from a physical anchor, it becomes fluid. And so this is why now when you read definitions of gender possibilities now in the current and expanding literature, you read things like this. You'll read of people who are gender expansive. This is for those who identify in a range of ways outside male or female binary. Or gender fluid, for those who experience their gender identity as shifting to some extent. So with the riverbanks of biology crumbling, gender becomes as fluid and varied as our feelings. And so this is the situation we're in, and it raises some questions for Christians, thoughtful questions. We're not trying to be mean. It's just a really big deal to see this kind of change happen. So we need to ask, what is actually going on when a young person, a professing Christian, can so easily believe that her inner feelings rather than her body dictate whether she's a man or a woman? And what's going on when a culture so quickly enshrines the idea that gender is fluid and varied, that the old binary male and female wasn't just wrong, but it was oppressive? How should parents or churches or friends respond when a loved one experiences gender confusion or decides to transition? These are some of the questions I have in mind that will guide us with the rest of our time. And the rest of our time is just going to break up really into two headings. Heading number one is deeper understanding. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to spend some time trying to understand the basic ideas of the transgender movement. So deeper understanding. This is the Christian working towards clarity. Deeper understanding. After that, we're going to talk about compassion and engagement. Deeper understanding, compassion, and engagement. Those are the two headings. As we get to compassion and engagement, I'll open the floor for questions so we can have a bit of a conversation. So, deeper understanding. Movements have skeletal structures. There's ideas that make them possible. So you could think of an analogy. If you think about this room, You probably haven't thought about this, but there's framing all around this room, right? Behind the walls, there's framing in the ceiling and on the floor. And this framing was laid first. And the framing in this room is actually what determined its shape, and it's what gives its stability. The same is true with the movement. But behind what we're seeing with the gender movement is framing. These are core ideas and beliefs. These are the things that give the movement structure and stability. So what I want to do under deeper understanding is I just want to pull back some drywall and ask, what ideas make it possible for so many people right now to think that your body does not dictate your gender? And what kind of ideas do you need to have to think that you could dismember or change your body and actually change your gender? And I'm going to look at 3 ideas that I think give the gender movement its shape and stability. And in each idea, I'm going to look at it in terms of how the transgender movement understands it, and then I'm going to compare it to Scripture. And the 3 ideas involve identity, embodiment, and healing. These are the core things at play behind the gender movement. Identity, how do I know who I am? Who decides who I am? That question is core. Second, embodiment, what's my body? Does my body tell me who I am, or can I tell my body who I am? And third is healing. By healing, I mean, what do you do with your pain? Is transitioning a pathway to wholeness, or is there a better way? So identity, embodiment, and healing. So let's start with identity. Again, we're looking at the deep ideas behind the gender movement. And by the way, it's almost 4:50. This goes till 5:30, right? Okay, all right. Okay, we'll be all right. All right, so identity. You can't really understand today's gender movement if you don't understand our culture's obsession with identity. I mean, this is really at the core of it. And identity is really about the question, who am I? Now, traditionally, up till about like 5 minutes ago in the history of the world, our identity was something we received. It was therefore largely stable. Who we are was determined by family of origin, nationality, biological sex, religion, and perhaps vocation. These matters were largely given, and they were beyond our control. But things have changed. Today, identity is a do-it-yourself project. It's about self-definition, self-discovery, and self-expression. So here's the first core belief that underlies or is behind the walls of the gender movement. My identity is self-determined. Who I am is whoever I say I am, and you better back off. When it comes to myself, I'm not a creature, I'm the creator. So let me ask, because we've all imbibed this, let me ask, is that biblical? Is that a biblical approach to identity? How would we find out? I'm going to turn to Genesis 1 and take us through the whole Bible. Just kidding. I'm going to take us to Genesis 1 because that's the creation of the first human beings. And we'll just ask, can we find anything else about identity by looking at Genesis 1? Now, the dominating note that sounds in Scripture, the Scripture portion about human origins there in Genesis 1, is that God is the creator and we're his creatures. So leading up to the announcement of our creation in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, we see God doing all the acting. Here's just some of the verbs with God as the subject. God created. And by the way, these are said multiple times in the first chapter of Genesis. God created, God said, God separated, God called, God made, God set, God blessed. Life is from God and according to his design. That's a dominating theme that comes through. Then in Genesis 1:27, when we read of our beginning, I want you to note that in Genesis 1:27, the verb create is used 3 times. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. The emphasis to use this verb created, which is a loaded word, to use this 3 times makes a point. a human, whatever else we are, we neither determine our existence nor our design. We're not our own author. Our identity, who we truly are, is God-given, not man-made. Now, God grants us the dignity of stewarding and expressing this identity, and it'll actually be part of the judgment day. We'll be judged at how we steward these opportunities, for me, of being a male, for some of you, of being a female. But we don't have a license to determine it. Steward it, yes. Develop it, of course. Determine it, no. So biblically, the first flaw underlying the transgender movement is the idea that identity is self-made rather than God-given. You got that? Identity self-made versus God-given. That's a massive difference. But if that idea is afloat, you can kind of do whatever you want. So that's the first problem. So that's identity. The other core idea, if we get behind the wall, has to do with embodiment. This whole gender identity conversation plays out along the canvas of the human body. So we have to ask about our bodies. Over a decade ago, I was a graduate student in England. And this was actually my introduction to the whole gender identity conversation. Was I became friends with a fellow student. This fellow student was not a believer. And this person, we became buddies, and he opened up to me that he was struggling with confusion about his gender, and he was planning a surgery to change his gender. And at that point, he was experimenting. He'd been taking a hormone, and he was experimenting with some cross-dressing. And he had long hair. All of a sudden, I started to notice just some things that he would do, and I thought, okay, I can see this now. And we got together one day, and he asked me this question that I thought was profound. He said, "Sam, do you feel like a man?" I said, "I do." He fired back, "What does that mean? And don't tell me it means you like girls in sports. What does it mean to feel like a man?" I wonder how you would answer that. Super interesting question. And for years, that question and that exchange troubled me because I couldn't find a way to answer the question, what does it mean to feel like a man, without reaching for cultural stereotypes? Well, it means I like blue more than I like pink. I like short hair, it's right away you're like, this can't be it. And then it hit me. It was like a decade later. It hit me. His question contained a faulty premise. He didn't ask me if I was a man. He asked me if I felt like a man. Subtle but seismic, he shifted the location of gender onto my emotions. Now, that may seem fine to you, saying that our feelings, not our biology, determine our identity, but try applying it to a few different things. Let's apply it to age. A 15-year-old goes into the bar to buy a beer. And he gets carded, puts the card out, says he's 15. The bartender's like, "You're 15. He goes, no, you don't understand. I feel 21. I feel 21. He's like, "It doesn't matter. Your age is a biological fact. It's not a feeling." Or how about we apply it to ethnicity? A white male is applying for a scholarship designated for African Americans. The university examiner looks at him and says, "What are you doing in here? This isn't for you." He goes, "No, you don't understand. I feel black. I do. I feel it." You know what he says? He says, ethnicity is not predicated on how you feel. You may have feelings about your race. You may have feelings about your age. But at least up till 2024 in the West, biology still determines, cold hard facts still determine age and ethnicity. Why is it different for gender? Is it any less obvious biologically, whether you're male or female, than if you're black or white? Or perhaps how old you are? So you can see that in my friend's question, do you feel like a man? Do you feel 21? Do you feel white? You begin to realize that something is profoundly different about where we're locating gender. It's not in the body, it's in the belly or the mind. So we need to ask, is that biblical? Is it biblical that your gender identity is no longer your body, but your feelings? Is that biblical? Now, where would we turn to answer that question? Genesis 2, anybody? We're going to Genesis 2. I told you we're walking through the Bible. Okay. Genesis 2 is like a zoom lens on the creation scene. It kind of zooms in on Genesis 1, 26 and 27 to the creation of the first man and the first woman, the creation of Adam and Eve. And when we read Genesis 2, we see that God is giving people bodies. He's creating them. And he's also creating a man and a woman, a male and a female. So maybe we can look at Genesis 2 and ask the question, is Adam's maleness a feeling or is it his body? Is Eve's femaleness her feeling or her body? Let's just walk through this and see. So in Genesis 2:7, you have the man being created. And I'll read these for you. You can follow along. It says, the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. What you see here is that there are two elements going into the human, right? God formed the man from the dust. The Adam is from the Adama, like it's physical, right? But then he breathes into him the spirit. So a human being really is physical, along with some other element that is more than physical. Does that make sense? Can you see that? So you could ask the question at this point, see, I got you, Christian. That's what I mean. I mean, you can have kind of the physical body, and then maybe when God puts the spirit in you, maybe it's a female spirit by accident, right? Or a female soul or something like that, right? Maybe gender lies in that inner part of you, that more subjective part. Well, does it? Well, let's keep reading. Let's keep reading. In the rest of Genesis 2, where does the emphasis lie on maleness and femaleness? I want you to see that it lies in embodiment or physicality. So when God makes the man in Genesis 2:7, it says that the Lord formed the man from the dust of the ground. The verb there, formed, is a verb that's used elsewhere in the Bible for a potter forming clay. So he's forming a man. He's not breathing into him maleness. He's forming the man. And then when he creates the woman, he takes a rib from the man's side, and it says, this is verse 22, and the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he built, or he made into a woman. And he brought her. Again, that's the verb, built. It's different than the verb formed. It's built. This verb is used elsewhere in the Old Testament for building a city or for shaping an altar. Again, it's very physical. In both cases, the emphasis is on the physicality of the shaping. God has his hands dirty with bone, ribs, and dust, and he's forming things like a potter that are physical. And then, just to let you know that the gender is rooted in the physical shape of the body, to emphasize this is the one flesh union in Genesis 2:24, where the two come together and become one flesh. That bond of one fleshness, it's not just emotional or relational, it's physical. And it is sensible only because of the anatomical complementarity of the male and female body. That's a bulky phrase, but the one fleshness that happens with the man and the woman tells you that maleness and femaleness is never less than biology. It may be more, but according to Genesis 2, the emphasis on the first man and the first woman is that they physically are formed and they're physically different in such a way that they anatomically complement one another. So, friends, in a profound sense, our body is our gender. As Greg Allison, good old Baptist theologian, writes, we are gendered all the way down. Every cell in a woman's body has an XX sex chromosome. Every cell in a man's body has an XY chromosome. And it's always interested me that in Genesis 1 and 2, there isn't a hint about ethnicity. You know, this book is given for Israel's founding. You think they might slip in and God made them Jewish for sure, right? It doesn't tell you, you don't hear anything about ethnicity till basically the call of Abraham. I mean, you have the table of nations in Genesis 10. But what does come up in Genesis 1 and 2 is gender, meaning you can never get below gender. You can't get underneath it. You're either a male or a female forever. And it's in your body. And when Jesus was raised from the dead, Jesus was incarnate as a male. He came forth from Mary as a male, as a boy. This is clear. When he's resurrected from the dead, in Luke 24, he comes to his disciples and he says, I'm not a ghost. Touch me. Feel me. Does a ghost have flesh and bones? And then when you see the crescendo towards the end of the Bible, Jesus is presented as what? A bridegroom. In other words, the gender God gave you when he made you, even if there's psychological dissonance, the body he made you with, when the resurrection happens, there will be an element where God will be affirming the goodness of the work he began at your conception. He's saying, I don't need to start over. I made Sam a man, and he will glorify me as such for the rest of time. Okay, so you follow me? That's identity. It's either I am whoever I say I am, or it's God-given. Identity is either man-made or God-given. Embodiment is either the clue for gender, or you can discard your body and listen to your feelings. Okay, so these are big differences. Third, healing. You guys hanging with me? The third is healing. And so this is probably where I think Christians and people in the transgender movement find themselves almost in the exact same place, and we should be able to understand ourselves really well. At least the people I've talked to who really have gender dysphoria, they're not like, boy, I woke up and I wanted to have gender confusion. It's making my life great. Typically, they're going through a really hard psychological, emotional, social season in life. And what they want at core, even beneath the transgender movement, they want to be okay. They just want to be happy. Whatever the opposite of pain is, that's what they want. And they want hope. So the transgender movement offers them hope, and it's in the form of healing and change. It's called transitioning, right? You can transition from a state of pain into a state of happiness. It's just that their model for transitioning involves puberty blockers, surgeries, cross-dressing, and we really have very little idea about the long-term effects of a lot of these things. As Dr. Colt St. Amand of the Mayo Clinic wrote in a newspaper article recently, he does this kind of work. He said, I'm less concerned. He talks about when kids come to him to transition. He goes, I'm less concerned with certainty around identity. I'm more concerned with hearing the child's embodiment goals. Do you want to have a deep voice? Do you want to have breasts? What do you want for your body? And now the method for healing is presented as transitioning. And before I compare this to the biblical view of healing, because look, if we're going to have anything to say to the transgender movement, it better be more than just a couple abstract truths about identity and the body. You got to be able to look at your friends and be like, I can give you hope. Like there is healing too in the gospel. But before we look at that, let me just point out some concerns that we all should have. Whether you're a Christian or not, I think these are reasonable concerns to have with the modern approach to healing the gender dysphoric person through transitioning. Puberty blockers, hormone treatment, surgeries. 3 concerns. First, affirmative therapy moves too quickly with kids who are still developing. And I think we're seeing this more and more, particularly in the UK and in Europe. We're just realizing that these kids are too young to make these decisions, and we shouldn't be moving fast. We're also realizing that a lot of this confusion is probably driven by social contagion, peer pressure, social media influence, rather than some sort of true inner condition. So we're just moving too fast with kids. Second, the methods of transitioning are inherently traumatic to our natural bodies. I find it very ironic that at the same time we've seen this summit of environmentalism, organic food, treat the environment really good, be very, very worried about global warming, right? You have to see, environmentalism assumes this premise, that nature should be treated in a natural way. You got to assume that. Like, you ought not to cut down a tree in the rainforest. You shouldn't pollute a river. How do you know? Prove it to me. The tree's not telling me not to cut it down. Tree doesn't talk. A person just says, no, there's a natural way you should treat nature. Fair enough. But these Why don't you just apply that to the human body? So at the same time where people don't want to eat chicken with hormones in it, they'll pump their child full of hormones. Or at the same time we don't want to cut down trees in the rainforest, we will cut off perfectly healthy members of the human body. And so there is an inconsistency here that does profound violence to nature. The unspoken, voiceless victim of the transgender movement is the human body. And so I think we need to own that if you're going to eat organic food and refuse chicken with hormones in it, you cannot uphold the ideology of the transgender movement in terms of transitioning, because you're not treating nature in a natural way. So that's the second problem I see, again, without bringing any Christianity into it. Third, when affirmative therapy, the therapy that tells you to change your gender according to your mind, when it's judged by its own stated goals, transitioning hasn't proved effective. People do see short-term effect, but long-term, there's just no data to suggest that if a person starts taking puberty blockers and then transitions to hormone therapy and then has surgeries between the age of 12 and 25 and then lives on a regime of chemicals for their spouse, we just don't know if that's good for them. It's probably not for testosterone is probably not good for bone density. I mean, there's several things that we need to be thinking about before we do this. So Sweden of all places, Sweden's National Board of Health and Welfare noted in 2021 the risk of hormonal interventions for gender dysphoric youth outweigh the potential benefits. So when it comes to the options for getting out of our pain, for healing, we as Christians have to look at the offer of transitioning. That's the pathway out of pain, according to the gender movement. And we simply have to say, I don't think it's good enough. So when I meet with gender dysphoric people, what I often say to them is, I just think transitioning gives you too low of a ceiling. It's too low. It's too low. It's cosmetic. It's dangerous. And I want to set before you an option for wholeness that has a higher ceiling. And that's what we're going to turn to. How does the Bible approach healing for someone with gender dysphoria? Well, where should we turn in the Bible to answer that question? We're in Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Where do you think we should turn? Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, we find out that this first man and woman, things just don't go swimmingly for them. And sin enters the world. And, this word dysphoria, it refers to a state of feeling very unhappy or uneasy or dissatisfied. As I said, it's the opposite of euphoria. But, Christians have a very robust theology of dysphoria. Do you know that? We see that because of the fall, this plunge into sin and exile and brokenness began with Adam and Eve. We see the effects of this across the Bible. They include things like darkened hearts, debased minds, slavery to passions, inward groanings. Even Paul says wasting away. This brokenness affects all people. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So crime, cancer, schizophrenia, depression, barrenness, abandonment, and disease are all results of the fall. They're just the way we broke. And so much is affected. Even aging. Aging is the first sign of your mortality. It's not the way it's supposed to be. Gender dysphoria is a subcategory of human dysphoria. Dysphoria means, biblically, that there's dissonance between the way your heart wants things to be and the way the world is on the outside. The way your passions feel and the law of God, right? And so we all have experiences of things we could call dysphoria. Now, the Bible's not just a book about the fall into this type of dysphoria and confusion. It's a book about God's triumph over brokenness and sin. The key term of the transgender movement is actually a prefix. It's the prefix trans. And trans is derived from a Latin preposition, trans, which carries the sense of moving across or moving toward. It's the idea of movement, moving to the farther side or beyond. The prefix trans, it sits in front of the two most important terms of the movement, transgender and transition. And it captures the desire of a person with gender dysphoria to move from a state of pain to a state of wholeness. Who could fault them for that? Of course they want to get out of a state of pain. Do you know our English Bibles also use this prefix? Can you think of a word it shows up on? Transformation. Trans is actually a biblical concept, believe it or not. Paul describes Christians, 2 Corinthians 3:18, we all, with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. So this is our third. We looked at identity, we looked at embodiment. Now we're talking about getting out of our pain, and we're setting two racehorses side by side, transitioning and transformation. Does that make sense? And we're going to let them run, okay? How is transformation better than and different than transitioning? 3 ways. First, transformation is from the inside out. Transitioning is the outside in. Change the outside of the body, how it cosmetically looks, to fix the inner mind. Transformation is totally the opposite. Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. In Romans 8, we're told that the Spirit will raise our bodies from the dead on that day. But before the Spirit raises our bodies from the dead, the Spirit is at work in your inner man or inner woman. So transformation biblically has to go way on the inside, which means how you feel and how you think may be the first thing that needs to be changed. Second, transformation culminates when God resurrects our bodies, not when we remake them. So we see again in Romans, Paul says, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we await eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Hugely important. Ongoing groaning because of our bodies is part of the deal. Paul says, as we eagerly await the redemption of our bodies. We're told later by Paul in Philippians 3:17 or 27 that when our bodies are raised, Jesus will change them to be like his glorious body. And so that's the second thing. The transgender movement arrests the body from the Creator and remakes it in its own inner image. The Christian view gives the body back to the Creator and trusts that he will raise it from the dead in perfection with how he has made it in his image. Do you see the difference? The third way transformation is different from transitioning is that transformation is the Spirit's work in the context of Christ's new community. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we're God's children. The Spirit prays for us. The Spirit unifies us with other Christians. We walk by the Spirit. The transgender movement's agent of transition is the scalpel. Christianity's agent of transformation is the Spirit. The transgender movement sees change as primarily cosmetic on the surface. Christians understand change to be inner and deep. It begins in the soul. It moves through our character. It culminates in a perfected, imperishable, embodied existence. A transition takes place in a clinic or on our operating table, but transformation is lived out in the context of the church with God's people, the family of faith. I've gone 45 minutes. I need to wrap up. I only did the first part. The second part is compassion and engagement. I knew that would happen because we'll get to that, but I just want to summarize this by saying our desire for immediate gratification, our obsession with thinking that we create our own identity, our cluelessness about the fact that our bodies are from our Creator, all these things are at play when young people find it so obvious and easy that their gender may be how they feel and they should be able to change it. And transitioning, friends, it offers a quick fix. Chemicals, new clothes, you have your YouTube station, it's really fun and exciting, but it peters out, it has a bad ending. Transformation, however, and this is what we're up against, it's slow, it's hard. So much of the Christian life is learning how to be sanctified in our pain. It's learning that God may give you dysphoria so you're holy. God may give you cancer so you go to heaven instead of hell. It's just this strange way that he sanctifies us through hard things sometimes. And so we really do have to think about holding out a vision. I think of this vision of becoming a servant instead of a self. If you can tell a person, I don't care what your gender is, why don't you say for the next week, I don't care about my gender, but name 3 people in your school with real names and ask what their biggest needs are or their practical needs are and say, who are you today? I'm Bobby's servant. Are you a man or a woman? I'm just Bobby's servant, my classmate. I come to school to pray for him and serve him. And you start to take on a form of someone who's thinking less about themselves. But this gets into the discipleship end of this conversation, because I think to address this issue, we need a whole back end of this talk about how we do discipleship. But I'm going to stop there. I want to give 15 minutes now for questions. If you don't have any questions, I could say I have a couple things here that are practical for parents and churches to do, but I'd rather pause and just say, do you have any questions about this? Comments, things that are confusing to you that I said? Yeah.
I think you would probably address this in terms of engagement.
Yeah.
A family member asks you to use pronouns or a name that's different from their natural pronouns or their given name. What do you do?
Yeah. Let me say 2 things. One, I think we need a really robust understanding of the freedom of Christian conscience. In other words, different families may come down in different places, and I wouldn't want to be overly prescriptive. As a pastor of a local church, I may come up with a way that all our members need to follow, but I would be very careful going beyond that. This other thing I would say is, if you have a kid that's under 18, your goal in life is not for them to like you. It's for them to respect you. And so I think it's perfectly okay to say, you don't tell me what to call you. And I understand it's more complicated than that, but I've seen this in my church so often now. If you give an inch, it doesn't really accomplish much. So I think if the pronoun thing, I would resist using pronouns, preferred pronouns. I might, if a person wants to use a name that's a little bit more generic, like a nickname, like can I just go by M for a while? I might say, I have a family doing this right now, be open to that. But I would be really careful. Now, outside of the home, in the workplace, again, that's different. If you're a teacher at a school, you're going to have to decide with your conscience before God, can you use the pronouns or not? And if you can't, you need to go ask if the administration is going to be intolerant and fire you because of it. But that's a really tough question. But for pastors who are in here, I would be careful about being overly prescriptive from the pulpit. I would work on these issues in your office, in the home, carefully with people. Yeah, super tough. Yeah. Yeah. No, if I could try to restate what you said, what if it's not your kid, but it's somebody you deeply love? Your niece or nephew, your grandchild. Really, really hard. You have to, sometimes it's painful, but draw the lines of responsibility and authority. Like, if child services gets upset about someone's parenting of that child, it's not going to be because of you. It's going to be because of their parent. So legally, you are not their parent. So you have a limit to what you can tell them. I think you need to talk to your adult children very seriously. Try to do some reading. I got a little booklet on this. It's like 44 pages long. It's for sale out there, and it's got a bunch of data in the back that'll just help you say, look, even Sweden is backing off of this. So encourage them to go as slow as possible. Slow instead of fast. I like to say, a kid wants to be a helicopter taking off immediately. You want to get them on the tarmac circling, not taking off. Do you know what I mean? And eventually you want to get them out of the pilot seat into the passenger seat. But that image, hey, let's just circle, easy, circle the tarmac. Slow it down as much as you can. But I think every family's different. That's a super hard situation. Yeah. Any other questions? One in the back, then one here. Yeah. He said you can go first. Yeah.
So we're the parents of an older child
Yeah.
who decided to do the transition
Yeah.
at age 29.
Okay.
So our along with many other things, there's no communication
Yeah.
because it's so adversarial
Yeah.
that communication has been cut off. What strategies do you tell parents to
Yeah.
try to reconnect, or is there any reconnection?
Yeah.
If you look at it and go, look, I love you, but you're my son, and I can't.
Yeah. Yeah, I just had a family in my office last week who sent a son to college, is graduating as a woman. And we're talking through all this. I think you do everything you can to maintain a relationship. And I think this is one of the most painful things people go through, and I'm so sorry you're going through this. I think do everything you can to maintain a relationship. I think what that looks like is in some ways just saying, hey, I will always love you. And I think can we rethink through this relationship, because your mom and I, we have a faith identity. Again, the identity is the key thing to use. It's the language that they use. Our faith identity is as important to us as gender identity. And as much as you want us to respect your gender identity, would you entertain a possibility of respecting our faith identity? And that may mean we just don't do certain topics, but also, for your mom and I, could we come down on a place of like a name or something that's more appropriate to call you for us, for our faith identity, and just ask. And I just think, this is brutally painful, but Jesus teaches about times where discipleship with him will drive a wedge between parent and child, child and parent. We read that, and then when you see it happening in people's lives, it's so hard. Every child's different, but at some point they love you. They love you. They're gonna want you in their life. Play the long game. Try to stay in relationship, and over communicate if you have to. Just like, hey, this is where we're at. We won't bring it up all the time, but will you accept us? Will you tolerate us based on our faith identity? We won't push you anymore. You know where we stand, but we'd love to see you sometimes. We'd love to pray for you. Yeah, in the back. Yeah. Did you say, how do we continue to communicate?
What I want you to do is to go back to the two issues you've not covered yet, and just continue with that.
Compassion and engagement?
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, I'll rapid fire this. If you're a parent and you have a young child coming to you, now, by the way, nothing I'm saying is like, here's the silver bullet. This is extremely difficult. Most situations I'm in, see children continuing to transition. We have one in our church who desist. They went back. But a parent should ask what else is going on with a teenager. Things don't happen in isolation. So especially if they're 12 or 13, maybe they don't like their body in general, right? Very common. Maybe they don't fit in with their peer group. Ask what else is going on. Don't be anxious if your child's interests aren't stereotypical when they're really, really young. It's not crazy if a boy wants to play with dolls. Don't overreact. Establish clear boundaries in the home. I think it's perfectly godly and your biblical responsibility to be clear about this in a loving way. God has a very high view of parents, and it's not one where they follow their children. They lead. They lead gently and lovingly. But most parents that I deal with, they haven't been equipped to talk about this. So one of my points in application is churches equip parents to talk about this. And again, I'm not trying to promote myself, but this little booklet is for that. Pick it up out there. Does God care about gender identity? I wrote this for people in our church. These were talks I did for them. And it may be a C-, but it's something. And guard against negative cultural influences. So the family that saw their daughter desist in my church pulled her out of public school and put her in a homeschool co-op. She hated them for it. But a year later, it was like the noise died down. And so particularly with young adolescents, 11, 12, 13, I think it's different if they're 16, 17. Certainly if they're 29, it's different. But early on, it is okay to have a huge change. Move. Don't raise your kid in Washington, D.C., right? Don't send them to the best cool private school, where they'll definitely get into Harvard. It's like, you're going to have to think outside the box. Because if you go back to my Ephesians talk, this is where all this connects. We're not ourselves by ourselves. So you're putting that little fish in a very, very toxic pond. And so I think you just have to, not everybody has options outside of public school. That's what churches have to help with. Social media. Man, there's nothing but negative stuff coming out about smartphones with kids. It's just, so be very, very careful. Most people watch a bunch of stuff about transitioning before they transition. Kids just kind of, douse themselves in these things online. I'm flying through this. Churches, what should you do? Teach. Create cultures of support and hope. Get little groups of families. If you know a few families with LGBTQ stuff, I just am doing this in my own church. Connect parents. Parents feel alone. They feel shame. When their kid comes home from college to be at church at Easter, they don't come. It's really painful. And so we'll do little evening seminars with small groups of people, and we'll just connect them. So teach, cultures of support, counter catechesis. And this is where pastors have to ask these questions about identity, embodiment, and transformation. And how do we begin to teach really differently early on? It's just about 5:30. I could take one more question, or I could tell you one more story. Here, this is a question. Okay.
How much of what you just said is in that book?
A lot of it. Said better. Yeah. Yeah, it's all in there. Yeah, I think. Most of it's in there. Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah. Yeah.
We actually serve on opposite sides of D.C., and I love the way he said that he's a pastor in the Metro D.C. area, where I usually tell people I'm a pastor in Annapolis, which is a drinking town with a sailing problem. But I think yours just packs more punch. So I'm really glad to have you here.
We're inside the Beltway.
There you go. You actually are.
Metro DC.
So we need to be at supper, at dinner together at 6 o'clock, and that is going to be directly across the hall. And say it out loud. Oh, yes, Sam did mention his book. Is that available here at the back? Okay, there is a book available at the back for everyone who wants one. So thank you very much.